A young wagon driver stood before a formation of British soldiers, his wrists tied above his head. The sentence was 500 lashes. This was an execution stretched into slow motion, with every crack of the whip tearing through flesh already soaked in blood. Most men never survived half that number, losing consciousness as the trauma mounted. But Daniel Morgan refused to give his tormentors that satisfaction. He counted every blow aloud, his voice growing weaker with the numbers, but never stopping. When the ordeal finally ended, the young Virginian reportedly smiled through broken lips. He whispered that the drummer had missed one, and that the British still owed him a lash. Cruelty often creates its own greatest enemy. By attempting to break Morgan's body, the British military inadvertently provided the catalyst for the man who would later destroy their Southern army. The British Empire functioned on the belief that a military succeeded through rigid discipline. Its power was built on formal education, expensive uniforms, and absolute obedience to aristocratic rank. Daniel Morgan was the antithesis of that system. He was a massive, illiterate runaway who settled arguments with his fists and carried a reputation for a volatile temper. He moved south into a frontier where class meant nothing. Survival required chopping trees, clearing land, and driving horse teams through a wilderness where disease killed as efficiently as violence. The British arrived in these forests believing their European rules could tame the land. They failed to see that the frontier was actively shaping survivors who were unimpressed by their polished uniforms. Morgan eventually found work transporting supplies across the Appalachian frontier. It was a profession that demanded calm decisions under constant uncertainty. Navigating rivers and avoiding bandits meant Morgan had to become an expert at reading the people around him. He watched to see who worked the hardest, who lied, and who kept their head when a journey turned dangerous. While British officers studied military theory in sheltered academies, Morgan's education was entirely practical. His classroom was a wagon trail, where a mistake in judgment could lead to a total loss of equipment or life. By identifying exactly who panicked under pressure and who kept their word, Morgan was learning how to identify the strengths and weaknesses of those he would one day lead into combat. This experience put Morgan on the front lines of a global war as he volunteered to haul equipment for General Edward Braddock's march into the Ohio Valley. Braddock marched thousands of professional soldiers in perfect formation through the dense woods. He assumed that the same rigid tactics used in Europe would overcome any obstacle the American wilderness could present. Without warning, the forest erupted. Invisible French soldiers and their allies struck from the cover of the trees, hitting the exposed British column with precise, focused fire. The rigid formations became easy targets. As officers fell from their horses, the disciplined lines dissolved into panic. Men fired blindly into the smoke, unable to adapt to an enemy that refused to stand in the open. Morgan witnessed the collapse of one of Britain's finest armies and walked away with a vital observation. The British military machine was fragile once it was forced to fight outside of its traditional rules. Tension between the frontier teamsters and the British officers eventually led to the argument where Morgan struck a lieutenant, knocking him to the ground with a single punch. He survived the 500 lashes that followed, a sentence that would have killed almost any other man. It proved to Morgan that his physical endurance could outlast the harshest punishment the army could inflict. His resilience was tested again during an ambush on a dispatch mission. A musket ball entered the back of his neck, shattered his jaw, and exited through his cheek. Despite losing teeth and bleeding profusely, Morgan refused to fall. He stayed in the saddle and rode mile after mile through the wilderness until he reached a British fort. These traumas left Morgan with a singular conviction. Power was not found in a rank or a commission, but in the stubborn momentum to stand up every single time he was hit. As the American Revolution began, Morgan's permanent scars, the ruined skin on his back, and the mark across his face, became his defining credentials. He did not command from a distance or rely on an aristocratic pedigree. He led men who, like him, had spent their lives surviving the frontier. His soldiers saw the evidence of his endurance and offered a loyalty that couldn't be bought with a salary. They followed him because he never asked them to endure a hardship he hadn't already survived himself. Morgan ignored the traditional military hierarchy, building his authority on a foundation of shared suffering and mutual respect. 25 years after the whipping post, the British sent a formidable army into the South Carolina fields to hunt him down. In less than 1 hour, Morgan used the British military's own predictability and arrogance against them, effectively destroying their entire force. The British Empire didn't just lose an army that day, they were defeated by a commander they had spent decades meticulously building. A young wagon driver is bound to a post, his wrists tied above. The officer reads the sentence with cold precision: 500 lashes. The British Army designed this sentence as an execution in slow motion. They intended for the sheer scale of the punishment to serve as a visceral reminder of absolute imperial authority. The soldiers expect screams. Instead, the driver refuses to give his tormentors that satisfaction. As the whip tears his back apart, he counts every blow aloud, his voice weakening but never stopping. When the ordeal finally ends, the young Virginian looks up through broken lips, smiles, and whispers a phrase that echoes through the American Revolution. The drummer missed one. The British still owe me a lash. 25 years later, that same British Empire sends one of its finest armies racing across the fields of South Carolina. Less than 1 hour later, that army ceases to exist. The battered man from the whipping post outthinks, outfights, and utterly annihilates them. His name is Daniel Morgan, and his total victory presents a historical puzzle: how a teenager with zero wealth, no formal education, and no military training outmaneuvers the world's most disciplined superpower. Morgan's early life leaves almost no paper trail, mostly because paper means nothing to him. He can barely read, he rarely writes, he is completely disconnected from any institutional education. While British officers study tactics in comfortable European academies, Morgan learns to survive in the chaotic expanse of the American frontier. He travels south into Virginia and takes any grueling job available, chopping trees, clearing farmland, and mastering heavy logistical equipment. Years of driving horse teams and lifting timber transform him into an intimidating physical giant by 18th century standards. He also earns a reputation for immense aggression. He argues constantly. Taverns frequently witness chairs breaking before conversations end. Court records paint a picture of a man who attracts violent trouble as naturally as breathing. But beneath that rough exterior, Morgan is constantly watching people. He is developing a hyper-vigilant ability to observe human behavior under extreme pressure. Transporting supplies across isolated trails plagued by bandits and war parties requires calm decisions during constant uncertainty. Morgan learns exactly who panics when ambushed, who lies to save themselves, and who holds their nerve when lives are on the line. Survival on the frontier demanded more than physical strength. It forced Morgan to become an expert at reading the cracks in human resolve before a situation turned fatal. This map highlights North America's undefined borders. When disputes between Britain and France escalate into global conflict, European armies are pushed into this wilderness. Supplying them requires massive effort. Morgan volunteers to haul equipment for British forces marching inland. As he drives his wagon, Morgan watches highly disciplined British soldiers marching in strict formations, clinging tightly to formal European battlefield doctrines. He immediately notices a massive disconnect. These commanders confidently expect the brutal, unpredictable environment to obey their neat, civilized rules. Applying strict geometric European troop movements to thick forests and uneven terrain creates immense friction. The rigid formations get stuck. A fluid, decentralized approach weaves through obstacles easily, but the British refuse to break their traditional lines. The Empire insists on maintaining its comfortable institutional traditions rather than adapting to the actual landscape around them. When those soldiers tied Morgan to a post years earlier, they believed they were simply punishing a disposable, illiterate peasant who stepped out of line. In reality, they were putting their rigid, predictable nature on full display for a man who had spent his entire life cataloging human weaknesses. Decades later, when they meet on the battlefield in South Carolina, Morgan does not defeat the British Army using vengeance. Hatred is a blunt instrument. His actual weapon is his deep understanding of psychology. He knows exactly how the inflexible British commanders will react under pressure, and he exploits their predictable behavior to trap them. The total destruction of the British force demonstrated the inherent vulnerability of an army that prizes ritual over reality. The greatest strategic minds are rarely built in comfortable classrooms or formal academies. They are forged by facing the chaos of the world exactly as it is and learning how to survive it. A young wagon driver stood before a formation of British soldiers, his wrists tied high above his head. The officer read the sentence with cold precision: 500 lashes. This was execution stretched into slow motion. Every crack of the whip tore through flesh already soaked in blood, designed to destroy a man's body before his spirit could even process the pain. Most never survived half that number. But Morgan refused to give his tormentors that satisfaction. He counted every single blow aloud, his voice growing weaker but never disappearing as the count climbed into the hundreds. When the ordeal finally ended, the young Virginian reportedly smiled through broken lips and whispered to the drummer keeping count, "You missed one. The British still owe me a lash." This attempt to violently break Daniel Morgan failed. Instead, it hardened him into an uncompromising leader who would spend the rest of his life turning his survival into a weapon against the Empire. 25 years later, that empire faced a full-scale rebellion. This 1775 map shows the conflict's massive scale, British territories looming over the 13 colonies. Congress recognized a harsh reality. American militias could never defeat the world's most disciplined army by copying rigid European open-field warfare. They needed a way to fight that the British had never practiced. The only place to find that kind of unpredictable warfare was the American frontier, a landscape that demanded survival skills over military polish. To build this new type of force, Congress called upon the very man the British had once tried to destroy at a whipping post. Morgan's understanding of British vulnerability began decades earlier during the French and Indian War. He watched General Edward Braddock lead a massive column of professional soldiers deep into the Ohio Valley. Thousands of men marched in perfect formation, their bright red coats standing out sharply against the endless green of the forest. They relied entirely on the rigid discipline that had won wars on the open plains of Europe. Without warning, the wilderness came alive. Invisible French and Native American forces attacked from heavy cover, turning the dense British formations into static targets that could not see what was hitting them. Morgan survived the retreat with a permanent lesson. Victory against a conventional superpower required abandoning European rules entirely and embracing the chaos of the terrain. Given command of a new rifle company, Morgan built his unit on survival skills rather than drill. He ignored social status and expensive uniforms in favor of raw capability. He recruited hunters and blacksmiths from the Shenandoah Valley, men who had spent their lives surviving in the woods and could hit a target the size of a squirrel from the top of a tree. These frontiersmen carried a specialized weapon. This comparison shows the standard British musket at the top, while the bottom weapon is the American long rifle, designed for the unique demands of the frontier. Standard muskets fired lead balls through smooth barrels, leading to erratic shots. The American rifles featured spiral grooves inside the barrel. These grooves made loading slower, but they made the lead balls spin, providing astonishing accuracy at long distances. Morgan paired this technology with extreme physical performance. When ordered to Boston, his company marched nearly 600 miles through mountains and rivers, arriving in just 21 days. Before firing a single shot in the Revolution, Morgan had already weaponized speed and specialized technology against a slow-moving, conventional force. Outside Boston, both armies sat in a stalemate, watching each other from a distance. For Morgan's riflemen, however, that distance became a tactical advantage. Morgan ordered his men to target high-ranking British officers from hundreds of yards away. One carefully placed shot from a concealed position could remove a commander before he even knew he was in danger. The psychological effect was immediate. British officers who once inspected their lines openly began to hide. They abandoned their prominent, brightly colored uniforms and avoided riding horses to keep from being identified by Morgan's snipers. By systematically eliminating leadership, Morgan dismantled the foundational hierarchy of the British military and destroyed their confidence from within. The ultimate test of his leadership came in late 1775. Morgan and his men were ordered to join a daring invasion of Canada, marching through the frozen wilderness of Maine toward Quebec. The conditions were horrific. Temperatures dropped below freezing, roads vanished into mud, and starvation became so extreme that men were forced to boil their own leather equipment for food. While traditional officers maintained distance from their troops, Morgan marched alongside his men. When they collapsed under their equipment, he carried their extra weight. He endured every hardship he asked them to face. He proved that true authority is most effectively commanded through shared hardship, creating a bond of loyalty that fear could never achieve. On New Year's Eve, in a blinding snowstorm, Morgan stood beneath the cowering stone walls of Quebec. He prepared his exhausted men for a final, desperate assault. He carried the permanent marks of his life on the frontier, the scar across his face from a musket ball, and the hundreds of scars across his back from a British whip. By attempting to break a young wagon driver with extreme violence, the British inadvertently created an uncompromising commander who understood their weaknesses better than they did. They had engineered their own greatest enemy. Quiet, atmospheric tone. Before sunrise on January 17, 1781, a heavy frost covered the fields of Cowpens, South Carolina. Through the bitter cold and morning mist, a feared British army marched steadily across an open pasture. The American defense appeared to crumble almost immediately. A line of colonial militia fired 2 scattered volleys, turned their backs, and ran. Seeing the retreat, British soldiers abandoned their strict discipline and aggressively charged after them, eager to end the battle quickly. This tactical vector map shows the militia drawing the British into a narrow, overextended column. By running, they pull the redcoat formation apart, stretching lines until gaps appear. This creates a pincer movement, relying entirely on predicting the enemy prioritizes pursuit over defensive integrity. Daniel Morgan engineered this alignment. He was an illiterate frontier wagon driver who had spent his life navigating the Appalachian wilderness. To understand how a woodsman engineered a victory that military historians still study for its precision, we have to look at the brutal, physical lessons that built him. Decades before the Revolution, Morgan hauled supplies across the American frontier. He navigated dense forests and untamed wilderness where survival meant paying close attention to how the environment dictated movement. He was there during General Edward Braddock's disastrous Ohio Valley campaign. He watched as thousands of professional British soldiers marching in rigid European formations were killed by unseen enemies firing from the thick woods. Looking at these reenactors, the limitations of British doctrine are clear. Their bright red coats and shoulder-to-shoulder formations were easy to track against a natural backdrop, turning a professional army into a stationary target. Morgan had little patience for the officers who enforced these rules. After he struck a British lieutenant during an argument, he was sentenced to 499 lashes, a punishment designed to enforce absolute obedience through physical trauma. Morgan survived by counting every stroke aloud. He watched the officers, observing how their entire system of control relied on the assumption that fear and pain could break a man's spirit. This revealed a vulnerability. The British were so committed to their own hierarchy that they could not conceive of an opponent who understood their predictability better than they did. When the Revolution broke out, the Continental Congress tasked Morgan with building a new kind of force, an elite corps of frontier riflemen. Morgan threw out the British manual. Instead of drilling his recruits to march in rigid lines, he trained them to prioritize independent judgment and blistering speed, expecting every soldier to make decisions without waiting for a command. Back at Saratoga campaign of 1777, Morgan used these riflemen to dismantle the British advance. He focused on neutralizing their command structure rather than fighting their infantry head-on. He ordered his snipers to ignore the rank and file and exclusively target British officers. From the tree line, they removed the men responsible for issuing orders. British officers at the front of columns suddenly collapsed. Without their leaders, the soldiers in the ranks were paralyzed, unable to reposition or return effective fire, leading to a massive British surrender. Morgan had proven that removing an army's leadership could systematically dismantle a superior force through confusion alone. Back at Cowpens, the trap is fully set. The British infantry have abandoned their careful formations and are sprinting after the retreating American militia. On the tactical map, the disorganized red vectors collide with a solid, unmoving line of blue American regulars. The British momentum is halted entirely as they hit a disciplined, bayonet-fixed defense. Simultaneously, Colonel Washington's cavalry bursts from concealment behind the hill, striking the exposed British flanks at a full gallop. The militia, who appeared to flee, have circled the battlefield in secret. They are now returning to the field, closing the final gap from the rear. Completely surrounded, Tarleton's elite field force ceased to exist in 55 minutes. Over 600 British soldiers were captured, while American losses remained astonishingly light. Daniel Morgan paid his debt of 499 lashes by weaponizing the very arrogance his enemy used to maintain control. He turned their pride into a predictable weapon, securing a victory that altered the course of the American Revolution. Grim, measured. Before he was a general, Daniel Morgan was a wagon driver tied to a post. He had punched an arrogant British officer. The sentence was 500 lashes. The whip they used was designed to tear flesh to the bone. Most men died from blood loss long before the count finished. Morgan refused to scream. Instead, he counted every single strike aloud. When the ordeal finally stopped, his back was mangled beyond recognition. Yet through broken lips, he reportedly looked at his captors, smiled, and told them the drummer had miscounted. He had only received 499 lashes. The British still owed him one. This image of British reenactors illustrates the military culture that ordered that whipping. The 1750s British Army operated as a rigid, class-obsessed machine. Aristocratic officers issued orders, and enlisted men, along with colonial workers like Morgan, were treated as disposable cogs. The entire system relied on absolute submission. Curious, observant. You control a massive empire by demanding unquestioning obedience. But by using physical torture to enforce that obedience, the British military hardened a man who completely refused to submit. They inadvertently built the exact leader capable of tearing their system apart. This view of the Appalachian Mountains shows the environment where Morgan actually learned to lead. The American frontier did not care about aristocratic titles or rigid lines. It rewarded extreme adaptability. You either learned to read the woods or you died. British General Edward Braddock ignored that reality. When he marched thousands of professional soldiers into the Ohio Valley, he deployed them exactly as he would in Europe: perfect columns, bright red coats, and a heavy reliance on parade ground commands. The result was an absolute massacre. Invisible French soldiers and their Native American allies fired from behind trees and rocks, using fluid hit-and-run tactics. Braddock's disciplined redcoats held their formations and became perfect targets. The army was systematically destroyed. Morgan survived that campaign, but a later ambush nearly killed him. A musket ball entered the back of his neck, shattered his jaw, and exited through his cheek. Now he carried a permanent scar across his face to match the whip marks on his back. He walked out of the forest with a terrifyingly clear realization. The wilderness ignores European rules. To survive a war in North America, a commander had to abandon strict traditional doctrine and embrace fluid, independent action. By the time the American Revolution erupted in 1775, the Continental Congress realized an uncomfortable truth. If they tried to fight the British Army by mimicking the British Army, they would lose. They needed soldiers who fought differently. Congress authorized new expert rifle companies, and Morgan got a command. He didn't look for polished gentlemen or men with impressive pedigrees. He rode through the Shenandoah Valley recruiting trappers, blacksmiths, and unrefined hunters who could hit a target from hundreds of yards away. These are American long rifles. Unlike the smooth-bore muskets carried by British infantry, these weapons featured spiral grooves inside the barrels. They took longer to reload, but those grooves gave the riflemen extreme, deadly accuracy at distances standard militaries considered impossible. Morgan ran his unit unlike any British officer. He rejected leadership by fear. If supplies needed lifting, he lifted them. If the men marched in the rain, he marched beside them. He built authority through shared physical hardship. This map of Boston marks the destination of their first true test. Upon receiving orders to join the siege, Morgan pushed his men on a grueling 600-mile sprint from Virginia. They traveled entirely on foot, arriving in just 21 days. Once outside Boston, Morgan unleashed his unit's specific capability. His riflemen targeted British officers from extreme range. By picking off commanders who thought they were safely out of reach, they stripped the enemy of their command structure and paralyzed their ability to maneuver. Morgan had successfully engineered a military force bound by mutual respect rather than the threat of a whip. They were loyal, they were lethal, and they were entirely self-sufficient. That self-sufficiency was put to the ultimate test on the final day of 1775. The Americans launched a desperate pre-dawn assault on the heavily fortified city of Quebec, advancing blindly through a howling blizzard. This engraving depicts the claustrophobic nightmare of Quebec's lower town. Morgan led his men directly into the maze, keeping his violent momentum high. He overran barricades and shattered defensive positions, knowing that speed was his only advantage. But elsewhere in the city, the attack stalled. Neighboring American columns lost their commanding officers to enemy fire. Without officers to issue instructions, the soldiers, conditioned to wait for top-down orders, froze in place. That hesitation was fatal. Given time to reorganize, British troops flooded the narrow streets, closing the escape routes and surrounding Morgan's exhausted remaining men. Facing overwhelming numbers with no way out, Morgan drew his sword. But rather than hand it over to the British officer demanding his surrender, he snapped the blade across his knee. Quebec exposed the fatal flaw in traditional warfare. When a military unit is trained to act only when told what to do, it will completely collapse the moment its command structure vanishes. Captivity presented a completely different kind of crucible. Behind prison walls, there was no momentum to maintain and no enemy to shoot. There were only endless, uncertain days that tested Morgan's resolve in a way combat never could. British interrogators quickly realized they had captured a brilliant tactical mind. They decided it was better to buy him than keep him. They offered Morgan a royal commission, high rank, and significant wealth if he would abandon the rebellion and fight for the crown. Morgan gave an immediate answer: no. The Empire had whipped him almost to death as a young man, and no amount of prestige could erase the memory of those 499 lashes. Months in a cell sharpened his focus. He had entered the war carrying a personal grudge against the British Army, but imprisonment turned that grudge into a concrete ideological belief that the colonies deserved to govern themselves. The British failed to secure his allegiance because they misunderstood how it worked. You cannot purchase true loyalty with royal titles. You forge it through shared values. After a prisoner exchange secured his release, Morgan returned to the American lines. Congress promoted him to colonel and handed him a mandate to organize a new elite force. It became known as Morgan's Rifle Corps. He built this unit on a single, unwavering philosophy: one steady, independent man is worth 10 careless, obedient ones. Watch how these systems operate. On the left, rigid European doctrine relies on absolute obedience, moving slowly as one block. On the right, Morgan's frontier doctrine relies on fluid movement. His riflemen exercised independent judgment. Facing obstacles, they never waited for orders. They acted immediately. Morgan weaponized independent thought against a military machine that demanded mindless obedience. And he built this weapon just in time. British General John Burgoyne was marching south with thousands of experienced soldiers to crush the rebellion. But Daniel Morgan was waiting in the woods, holding the exact doctrine needed to stop them. A young wagon driver stood tied to a post, enduring a sentence of 500 lashes. The heavy whip used for these punishments was designed to tear flesh from bone. It was execution by inches, a slow-motion destruction of both body and spirit. The 18th century British military functioned as a massive machine built on rigid discipline. Commanders maintained their order through terror, demanding absolute, unthinking obedience from their own ranks to keep those strict formations intact. But Daniel Morgan refused to give his tormentors the satisfaction of a scream. He counted every blow out loud. When the ordeal finally ended, he survived, famously noting through broken lips that the drummer had miscounted. They had only given him 499. A few years later, during the French and Indian War, Morgan hauled supplies for General Braddock. He watched those highly disciplined British formations march into the dense American wilderness, only to be decimated when ambushed by forces firing from cover. The scars across Morgan's back never faded, but the real transformation happened after he watched Braddock's redcoats collapse in the Ohio Valley. He had experienced the brutality of British discipline firsthand. Now he saw its fatal rigidity when forced to adapt to the chaos of the wilderness. By 1775, the American colonies were in open rebellion. The Congress faced a stark mathematical reality. They lacked the numbers, the powder, and the training to defeat the British Empire by matching them in traditional open-field combat. Survival required a different type of military leadership. They needed commanders forged on the frontier, men who understood how to exploit the predictable, slow-moving methods of a professional European army. Congress authorized several new companies of expert riflemen. Daniel Morgan, now a hardened survivor of frontier warfare, was selected to organize and lead one of these units. He ignored polished gentlemen and impressive family names, recruiting hunters and trappers instead. By replacing European military drill with frontier pragmatism, Morgan provided the Continental Army with its first real asymmetric warfare advantage. Morgan structured his elite rifle corps around a philosophy of shared risk. Instead of demanding mindless compliance, he expected his men to use independent judgment. He earned his authority by doing the heavy lifting alongside his soldiers, rather than issuing commands from a distance. This independence was paired with a specific technological edge. His soldiers carried American long rifles, which featured spiral grooves cut inside their barrels. Loading them took longer than a standard British musket, but the spin they put on a single bullet delivered lethal accuracy at distances the British considered impossible. The physical conditioning of these men was proven immediately. Ordered to join the Continental Army near Boston, Morgan's riflemen marched nearly 600 miles from Virginia on foot in just 21 days. This antique map of Boston Harbor shows the standoff between the entrenched British forces inside the city and the Americans surrounding them. Rather than lining up in open fields, Morgan's men used the terrain to systematically snipe British officers from hundreds of yards away. British commanders quickly stopped riding horses or wearing brightly decorated uniforms. Morgan had discovered that fear spreads faster than bullets. By specifically targeting leaders, he could dismantle an enemy's confidence before their main force ever entered the fight. This doctrine of independent action was tested on the final day of 1775 during the assault on Quebec. In a blinding snowstorm, top American commanders Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold were struck down. Without explicit orders from the top, the remaining traditional officers hesitated. Morgan urged his fellow officers to keep moving, knowing that speed was their only hope, but he was outvoted by men who insisted on waiting for reinforcements that never came. That delay allowed British troops to flood the surrounding streets, trapping Morgan and his men inside the city. While Morgan was in captivity, the British attempted to recruit him with the tools that sustained their own officer corps. They offered him rank, they offered him pay, and social prestige. They assumed his loyalty was transactional. He immediately refused. For a man who had already survived the Empire's worst physical punishment, their rewards meant very little. His resolve was rooted in a conviction the British recruiters couldn't calculate, a commitment to a cause that couldn't be bought or broken. By the summer of 1777, the revolution was faltering. British General John Burgoyne was marching south from Canada to control the Hudson River, aiming to split the colonies in two and end the rebellion. Morgan received new orders that granted him total tactical freedom. Operating entirely outside the main American army, his rifle corps melted into the forests ahead of the British advance, launching hit-and-run attacks on supply lines and scouting parties. When the armies collided near Freeman's Farm, Morgan issued a command that abandoned European rules of engagement. He instructed his men to explicitly ignore the common soldiers and intentionally assassinate the entire British command structure. The psychological toll peaked when British Brigadier General Simon Fraser was shot from his horse. Deprived of the officers who dictated their every move, the highly disciplined British formations panicked. Their lines dissolved into chaos. Morgan had successfully severed the head of the British forces. He proved that an army reliant on absolute, top-down obedience becomes defenseless the second the people giving the orders are removed from the field. The victory at Saratoga convinced the French government that the Continental Army could win the war. This led to formal French intervention, providing the money, troops, and naval power that ultimately secured American independence. Despite his performance, Morgan was repeatedly passed over for promotions by politicians in Congress. He eventually resigned and returned to his Virginia farm, his body marked by the scars of a whipping and the bullet wound that shattered his jaw. The British military sought to secure victory through the absolute, enforced obedience of the whipping post. Daniel Morgan proved that an army of independent thinkers, bound by trust and shared hardship, was far more dangerous. The wagoner who refused to be broken by the whip became the commander who broke the Empire's grip on America. A young American wagon driver was tied to a wooden post, sentenced by British officers to a punishment designed as a slow execution, 500 lashes from a whip that tore deeply into flesh with every strike. Most men died or lost consciousness within minutes. Daniel Morgan refused to give his tormentors that satisfaction. Instead of screaming, he remained entirely lucid, counting every single blow aloud as the whip struck his back. He survived. When the ordeal finally ended, Morgan smiled through broken lips and told the British drummer he had miscounted, and that the British still owe him a lash. The British designed this punishment to enforce submission through physical trauma. By remaining conscious and defiant, Morgan proved that their primary tool of control, intimidation, failed when the victim refused to be afraid. He walked away with a permanent understanding of the psychological limits of the British command system. In the 18th century, European warfare ran entirely on strict discipline. Armies fought shoulder to shoulder in brightly colored uniforms, commanded by aristocratic officers who expected unquestioning obedience from the men in their ranks. When the American Revolution began, the Continental Congress realized an uncomfortable truth. The colonies could never defeat the British Empire by trying to build a matching European-style military machine. Morgan already knew this. Years earlier, while hauling supplies for British General Edward Braddock, he watched perfectly organized columns of redcoats get completely shattered by irregular fighters deep in the dense woods. He saw firsthand that rigid formations were helpless in the unpredictable American wilderness. To win the revolution, the Americans had to move away from the European model of war. They had to adopt the same irregular tactics that had previously decimated British columns on the frontier. When Congress authorized a new unit of expert riflemen, Morgan ignored social class and wealth. He scoured the harsh Appalachian frontier for rugged hunters and trappers, whose survival skills were already sharpened by the wild. These recruits brought a distinct physical advantage. While standard British infantry carried smoothbore muskets, Morgan's volunteers were armed with the American long rifle. This schematic details the weapon's interior. Notice the spiral grooves cut into the metal barrel. When fired, these grip the bullet, forcing it to spin. Compared to a smoothbore musket's unpredictable scatter, the rifled bullet travels in a long, precise line, hitting targets at impossible distances. But advanced weapons require capable operators. In direct contrast to European commanders, Morgan expected every single soldier to make independent decisions in the heat of battle, without waiting for orders. The combination of long-range accuracy and independent judgment allowed these soldiers to operate without the oversight required in a traditional line. They hunted and made tactical decisions as individuals, regardless of where their officers stood. This frontier endurance immediately set them apart. Ordered to join the Continental Army, Morgan's men marched 600 miles through brutal summer heat, arriving in just 21 days. Once at the siege, Morgan deployed his core tactical philosophy. He instructed his riflemen to ignore the regular infantry and specifically shoot British officers, aiming to sever the head of the enemy army. The psychological impact was immediate. British commanders, who usually directed battles from horseback, were picked off from hundreds of yards away. Surviving officers panicked, abandoning their horses and stripping off their bright uniforms to avoid being targeted. Morgan had discovered a fatal flaw. Because their rank-and-file soldiers were conditioned to follow orders blindly, the British force became paralyzed the moment its leadership was removed. The ultimate test of his leadership philosophy arrived during a desperate midnight assault on Quebec in a blinding snowstorm. Leading directly from the front, Morgan and his riflemen surged through the blizzard and successfully overran the initial British barricades. But elsewhere in the city, other senior American commanders fell wounded or killed. Without clear orders, traditionally trained subordinate officers froze. Despite Morgan's frantic pleas to keep moving and press the advantage, they chose to wait for instructions. That hesitation gave the British time to surround them. Realizing escape was impossible, Morgan snapped his own sword over his knee rather than hand it to the enemy. Later, locked in a British prison, generals offered him a lucrative commission in their army. He gave them an immediate, uncompromising no. Quebec cemented Morgan's belief about leadership. True authority is not granted by an expensive uniform or a distant crown. It is earned through shared hardship and decisive action under pressure. By the fall of 1777, Morgan's theories faced their greatest trial at the Battle of Saratoga. His elite rifle corps was deployed to intercept General John Burgoyne's massive, traditionally structured British invasion force marching south from Canada. Instead of meeting the British on an open field, Morgan's men melted into the thick surrounding forests. Striking from cover, they systematically eliminated key British leadership, including the highly respected Brigadier General Simon Fraser, shattering the command structure. The loss of their officers sparked total collapse. Paralyzed and unable to coordinate a retreat, one of the Empire's most experienced armies found itself entirely surrounded, forcing thousands of British soldiers to surrender their weapons. Saratoga proved what Morgan had known since his days on the frontier. A decentralized, independent force of American fighters could outthink and destroy the rigid European model of warfare. The surrender at Saratoga altered the international landscape of the war. Within months, the French government, convinced of American viability, formally entered the conflict, providing the naval support and credit necessary to challenge British control of the sea. At the center of that triumph was Daniel Morgan, a man who began his life as an uneducated, unpolished frontier worker, only to become the chief architect of American irregular warfare. Daniel Morgan survived the Empire's attempt to break him, and used that experience to develop a style of warfare based on independence and resilience. The scars he carried for the rest of his life became the foundation for a new way of fighting that helped secure American independence and changed the world. January 17, 1781. Before sunrise, a heavy frost covers a pasture in South Carolina called Cowpens. Hundreds of elite British soldiers march forward into the freezing morning mist, expecting a swift and easy victory. Looking at the strategic map, the American commander, Daniel Morgan, appears to be cornered. He has positioned his men with a broad river directly behind them, seemingly cutting off any chance of retreat. As the British close the distance, Morgan's front line of ordinary militia raises their muskets. They fire exactly 2 volleys. Then they turn around and run. British commander Bannister Tarleton assumes the American line has collapsed. He immediately orders his men to break their disciplined formations and sprint forward to slaughter the fleeing rebels. But the retreat is a fabrication. The militia suddenly stops and pivots. Behind them, a hidden line of Continental regulars unleashes a massive volley at point-blank range, while American cavalry charges from behind a hill to strike the exposed British flanks. Within minutes, the trap snaps shut. This is a double envelopment, a difficult maneuver that effectively annihilates one of Britain's most feared forces in less than an hour. This psychological trap weaponized the pride of the British command and the predictable fear of the American militia. It was the masterwork of Daniel Morgan, an uneducated wagon driver who understood the human heart as well as the battlefield. Morgan's understanding of British rigidity began decades earlier during the French and Indian War. At Braddock's defeat, he watched elite soldiers get slaughtered because they refused to break formation while fighting in the woods. British reliance on rigid formations made them predictable. Within the dense American frontier, that discipline became a liability, leaving them dangerously vulnerable to ambush. This is a technical look at Morgan's primary innovation, the rifle corps. Unlike the standard British smoothbore musket, these long rifles featured spiral-grooved barrels, providing accuracy at distances the British considered impossible. During the Saratoga campaign, Morgan used this accuracy to disrupt the British command structure. He instructed his riflemen to ignore the common soldiers and specifically target officers to shatter the enemy's ability to coordinate. Because British soldiers were trained to obey rather than think, removing their leaders paralyzed their formations. Without someone to issue orders, their superior numbers often devolved into confusion. By the time he reached Cowpens, Morgan knew his enemy's aggression was a mechanical reflex. He understood that by offering the appearance of a panic, he could lead them directly into a slaughter. Morgan also had to manage his own soldiers. He knew his militia, mostly untrained farmers, were terrified of British bayonets. Rather than trying to suppress their fear, he accounted for it in his strategy. By asking for only 2 good shots before allowing them to fall back, Morgan turned a likely rout into a controlled tactical maneuver. He gave his men a mission they believed they could actually achieve. But his men did more than just fire 2 shots. They eventually returned to the fight. The trust required for that maneuver was earned by the 499 scars on Daniel Morgan's own back. Years earlier, a British officer had sentenced Morgan to 500 lashes. He survived the brutal punishment and reportedly joked afterward that the British still owed him 1 more lash because the drummer miscounted. This illustration captures the severity of the British punishment system. Morgan had personally endured and conquered the very brutality his men feared most. Morgan's leadership wasn't based on an elite education, but on shared suffering. The night before Cowpens, he visited nearly every campfire, showing his scars and speaking to the men as equals who shared the same stakes. Because Morgan spoke their language and carried their scars, the militia trusted his plan. They followed his instructions to retreat, but because of that bond, they had the resolve to reform and attack again. The defeat at Cowpens stripped General Cornwallis of his elite light infantry and shattered the psychological momentum the British had enjoyed in the southern colonies. Cornwallis reacted with fury. To catch Morgan's retreating forces, he ordered his army to burn their own supply wagons and abandon heavy equipment, sacrificing his long-term stability for immediate speed. This triggered the race to the Dan. Morgan led the British on a starving, exhausting chase, pulling Cornwallis hundreds of miles away from his coastal supply bases and deep into a hostile interior. This relentless exhaustion forced the British toward Yorktown to seek resupply. There, trapped against the sea by the French Navy and on land by the Continental Army, Cornwallis was finally forced to surrender. The man the British once tried to break with a whipping post had systematically dismantled Cornwallis's campaign. Morgan's resilience at Cowpens provided the strategic opening needed to win the war. Daniel Morgan's life suggests that tactical brilliance is often forged in hardship. Success came to the commander who chose to understand the resilience of the human spirit, rather than just the rigid rules of war.